Chapter 1. The Man Who Stepped Off the Train, the 3. 15 from Paddington rarely brought surprises to Rose Hill. Trains arrived and departed, occasionally carrying a cousin or a solicitor with a suitcase and a faraway look. But when he stepped onto the platform, the village's quiet rhythm faltered. He was unremarkable at first glance. Brown overcoat, worn but neat, a modest satchel, a tired hat. Yet his face held something elusive, like a half-remembered dream or a shadow glimpsed and forgotten. His eyes, sharp with purpose, scanned the cottages and rooftops, not lost, but searching for something or someone. Mrs. Elsie Ridgely, who ran the greengrocers, stood at the platform's edge, back from her sisters in Cheltenham. Her hand tightened on her handbag as she watched him. He wasn't dangerous, not exactly, but the way he inhaled the scent of the hedgerows, his gaze sweeping the village, sent a shiver through her, as if he were recalling something that hadn't happened. Without a word, he started down the lane toward Rose Hill's heart. Across the village, Miss Jane Marple folded napkins in her drawing room. Its floral wallpaper and faint lavender polished a testament to 2 years of quiet joys. She'd spent the morning writing to her nephew Raymond in London and had just taken tea by the window. Thursdays were for stillness, but life, she knew, had a way of interrupting. She was settling into her chair, a half-finished tapestry of a Devonshire landscape before her, when a sharp knock came at the door. Not the post, not the vicar. Few others called, unannounced. Adjusting her spectacles and smoothing her skirt, Miss Marple answered. The man on her step was tallish, lean, his face weathered but kind. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice gentle but measured. "Are you Miss Marple?" "Cass," she replied, tilting her head. "Can I help you?" He hesitated, just a fraction. Then, with calm clarity, he said, "My name is John Marple. I believe I may be your son." Miss Marple stood perfectly still, not shocked, not frightened, just still. She blinked once, slowly, as if cataloging his words. "I beg your pardon," she said softly. "I don't mean to alarm you," he added quickly. "I know this sounds strange, but I've found papers, information. I believe you gave me up many years ago." The breeze stirred the ivy against her cottage's stone. A sparrow chirped and darted away. The grandfather clock ticked on, unmoved by the moment's wait. "You had better come in," she said at last. The kettle was hot, and she poured tea with her usual precision milk first. As always, she studied him as he studied the photographs on her mantel. Herself in youth, a family portrait with Raymond, a sepia image of her parents' wedding. "You're certain of this information?" she asked, her voice unreadable. "I am," he spoke evenly. The birth certificate had a redacted name, but the address matched. So did the initials. And there were letters fragments from a woman who described this place almost perfectly. "I don't mean to cause trouble, Miss Marple. I only want to understand who I am." She regarded him with eyes that had seen lies and the liars who believed them. There was a resemblance to his nose, like her brother William's, his brief, lopsided smile, like her cousin Edward's. But resemblances could be imagined, conjured. She had never borne a child. She knew this with the clarity of cold water. "You are mistaken," she said kindly, setting her cup down. "I'm sorry, but I've never had a child, never been close to such a circumstance." John was silent for a long moment. Then, from his satchel, he drew an envelope and slid out a folded photograph, aged and frayed. He placed it on the table. Miss Marple looked down. It was her younger, sitting on a bench outside a hospital in Bath, a nurse beside her, a bundled baby in her arms. Her lips parted slightly. She didn't recall the photo being taken, but she remembered the day visiting her cousin Lydia after a difficult childbirth. Lydia had asked her to hold the baby while she spoke to the matron. Someone, unnoticed, must have snapped the picture. It proved nothing, yet it felt like something. By the time John left, dusk had settled over Rose Hill. He was polite, apologetic, promising to return only if she wished. Miss Marple closed the door, the photograph still on the table, its edges whispering questions she wasn't ready to answer. "Even perhaps I'm wrong," he said, "but I had to ask." Miss Marple nodded. Polly Televan smiled. She thanked him for being respectful. She told him she hoped he found what he was looking for, but the moment the door clicked shut behind him, she stood. Very still, something was terribly wrong. Miss Marple did not believe in Chapter 2, spring coins, nor did she believe in strangers claiming to be long-lost sons. Without counts, especially in a village like Rose Hill, especially not when, 2 weeks earlier, she had overheard the bank clerk whispering about a will, a substantial loan, linked to her late cousin, Lydia, and a potential unknown heir. Someone had read that same will. Someone had come to collect, and someone she suspected might be willing to kill for it. Chapter 2, The Whispering at the Crown and Feather. The Crown and Feather Inn had been part of Rose Hill's soul for nearly 100 years. It wasn't grand, and it certainly wasn't fashionable, but it was honest and quiet. It offered 2 things the villagers valued above all else: a warm fire in winter and something to gossip over all year round. The night the stranger came to town and claimed to be Miss Marple's son, Bothos comforts burned bright behind the carved oak bar. Stewed Mrs. Agnes Reeves, the landlady for more than 2 decades and an expert in reading faces. She'd poured pints for grieving widowers, hopeful poets, secret lovers, and con men with polished shoes. This man, John Marple, he puzzled her. He had taken room 3 without fuss, paid cash, asked for nothing special, polite, soft-spoken, and clearly intelligent. But there was a stiffness to him, not military, something else, like someone playing a role and not entirely comfortably. She watched from behind the bar as he sat alone at a corner table with a glass of bitter. He read from a worn book. David Copperfield, she noticed, and he seemed bothered by the glances thrown his way. And there were many. By 8 o'clock, the regulars were buzzing like bees in a box. "I tell you," whispered Jim Cadley, the chimney sweep, over his second pint. "He's her son, right enough. Looks just like her brother, George." "Same eyes, same stoop Cotswallop," muttered Moran Ellis, who taught Sunday school. "Jane Marple never had a baby. She's told me herself she never so much as held hands with a man after the war. This is all some game. You'd think he's after something, no? He is." Across the bar, Reverend Patel, who had the ears of the entire root congregation, but no head for secrets, leaned toward his wife. "He's too spoken to be a fraud," he whispered. "If anything, I'd say he believes wives, saying that's the dangerous kind." Mrs. Reeves polished a tumbler and said nothing. She wasn't one to feed rumors, but her hands moved faster than usual on the glacier, which meant she was thinking. At 8, the stranger stood up, nodded to her with a courteous, tired smile, and climbed the narrow staircasito. The rooms above, not a word said, not a question asked. Same evening, Miss Marple had not slept. She sat by her window with a shawl around her shoulders, watching the mist creep over the cobbled streets. Rose Hill was unusually still. Even the dogs were quiet, but her mind wasn't. The photograph haunted her, not because it showed her holding a child, but because it had been used to support a lie. She remembered the exact day, the rose garden outside St. Catherine's Hospital, 1932. Her cousin Lydia had suffered a terrible hemorrhage. Jane had been summoned and waited for hours while the doctor stabilized her. Someone had offered to bring tea. Someone had offered to take a picture. No, wait, that part she didn't recall, but with someone. It must have, and now it was being twisted to imply a secret that had never existed. Why? And why now a man pretending to be her son, a cousin's, or recently reopened a photograph from 40 years? Gazedently, emerging, these were not coincidences. No, this was a move, the appending move, in a quiet, deliberate game, and Miss Marple intended to respond with tone of her own. The next morning, she walked to Thepo's office. Behind the glass stood Mabel Griggs, a wiry woman in her 50s, hoe-handled letters like sacred scrolls. She was married to the village undertaker, and though she was not one to spread gossip herself, she certainly collected it. "Good morning, Mabel," Miss Marple said, with her usual pleasant nod. "Oh, Miss Marple, I thought you'd Paristing today. Why? Should I be?" "Well," Mabel hesitated, "you've had a bit of a surprise, haven't you?" "Indeed, and surprises are much like mushrooms, Mabel, harmless on the surface, but you must always check what's underneath." He smiled gently, then leaned closer over the counter. "I wonder if you recall any recent letters or parcels addressed to me that came from London, or perhaps posted anonymously." Mabel blinked. "Well, now that you say it, yes. About 3 weeks ago. Brown envelope, no return address, odd handwriting. I thought it was medical, perhaps a private report." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, but her smile stayed in place. "Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful." She left the post office and headed straight to Dr. Bevington's surgery. He was surprised to see her no complaints. "I hope, Miss Marple, non-Natal doctor, but I wonder, has anyone inquired about me recently? Someone from outside the village, perhaps asking about my health records?" Bevington frowned. "Well now, a man did phone a few days ago, said he was writing a book on village medicine and was researching women born in the 1880s. I didn't give him anything, told him to contact the records office in Truro, and did he not, that I know of?" Buth was persistent. Back at the Crown and Feather Room 3 sat untouched the man called John Marple had. Chapter 3. Sat untouched, left early for a walk, according to Mrs. Reeves. But by midday, whispers had changed to tone because someone had tried to break into the vicarage. It was only a back window. Nothing stolen, but the latch had been forced. Reverend Patil was certain nothing valuable had been taken, but his wife noticed something was off. "My filing drawer," she said, "where I keep baptism records, marriage registers. Someone looked through them." "I know they did." The village constable took a statement. "No fingerprints, just muddy boot prints on the windowsill and a faint smell of pipe smoke." No one said it aloud. Butavarian thought the same thing. The man at the inn had no business being in Rose Hill, and now that he was here, something dark was waking that evening. Miss Marple stood in her kitchen, chopping parsnips with unsettling calm. Clementine, the cat, meowed softly at her feet. Miss Marple did not respond. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Someone had broken into the vicarage. Someone had searched for church records, births, perhaps baptisms, anything to strengthen Allie, and only one person in Rose Hill would benefit from it, the man claiming to be her son. But what puzzled her more than anything was this: why go to such length? What fortune did he believe waited for him here? What inheritance could he possibly expect unless someone had promised? He moaned. Chapter 3. A letter that should never have surfaced. Letter arrived in the mid-morning post, folded neatly in a pale blue envelope with no return address, and only Miss Jane Marple's name written in an unfamiliar hand. The ink was slightly faded, as if the pen had been dipped one time too few, and the paper, though clean, carried the faint scent of lavender antage. Something about it felt deliberate. Miss Marple did not open it immediately. She placed it on the mantel while she prepared her morning tea, laid out her breakfast, 2 slices of buttered toast and a soft-boiled egg, and fed Clementine, who purred loudly and rubbed against her slippers. Only then did she turn to the envelope, adjust her spectacles, and slid it open with some silver letter opener she'd used since the war. The letter was short, only 6 lines. Dearest Jane, I don't expect forgiveness. I never have. But please understand. I did what I had to do. You were so young, so frightened. We both weren't. He deserved to know. Miss Marple read it twice, then a third time, and still her expression did not change. But a careful observer would have noticed the way her fingers curled slightly tighter around the paper, the way her eyes, though focused, had gone distant. Sook. She folded the letter once, very precisely, and slipped it back into the envelope. She knew only one person. It could be Lydia, her cousin, her friend, her mirror in so many ways, and her shadow and others. They had grown up together, endured that grief of the Great War, side by side, and parted ways when Lydia married young and moved to the northern coast. Over the years, they had exchanged letters filled with observations, sarcasm, and the occasional painful truth, but never had there been any mention of a secret like this. And now Lydia was dead, buried in St. Albert's churchyard just 3 months ago, which meant this letter, if annoying, had either been written long ago or recently unearthed by someone with Arison to send it now. Someone who wanted her to doubt herself, someone who wanted her off balance. Miss Marple, of course, had no such luxury that afternoon. She paid a visit to Dolly Featherston, who lived just beyond the green in a vine-covered cottage with a cluttered parlor and a great fondness for gossiping over sherry at 2 in the afternoon. Dolly opened the door wearing gardening gloves and a sun hat that had clearly seen better days. "Oh, Jane," she said breathlessly. Come in, Hayville. Heard what they're saying now, that this son of yours is actually the illegitimate child of a Vic Count. I mean, really, the stories get more creative by the hour." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I'm afraid it's rather more serious than that, Dolly. May I show you some method?" Once inside, she handed over the letter. Dolly read it in silence, her brow knitting with each passing word. "Lydia," she whispered. "Surely not. That's what I need to find out. But Jane, you've never been one to forget something like a child. You know your own life. Don't let this nonsense sway you. It's not myself." "I doubt," Miss Marple said calmly. "It's what someone else might want me to believe, which is a very different thing." Dolly nodded slowly, then leaned in close. "You think someone forged it?" "It's possible, but if it is genuine, then the question becomes, why now? Who found it? And what are they hoping to achieve by sending it?" Dolly poured them both a glass of cherry. "You think it's connected to that will of Lydia's? I heard from Nora at the estate office that there was some last-minute clause added before her death. Something about an unnamed heir." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Who told Nora her husband works for the solicitor in Truro. Files things, he hears all sorts." That was enough for Miss Marple by 4 o'clock. She was on her way to Truro, a short train ride away. The solicitor's office was on a crooked landing tucked between a dress shop and a saddler. A brass plaque read in N. Beckett, "Solicitors, 1878." Inside, the air smelled of dust and paper shelves lined with ledgers. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner. Miss Marple was shown into a small office where Mr. Harold Beckett, a thin chapter for Harold. Beckett's high-road-looking man with ink-stained fingers greeted her with the cordiality of someone who had met hundreds of clients and forgotten none. "Miss Marple," he said, rising to Waddy. "I owe the pleasure. I've come about Lydia Hargrass." Willie blinked. "I'm not listed as a beneficiary," she continued, "so I understand I'm not entitled to the details. However, I do believe a part of it has been misinterpreted, or perhaps manipulated." Beckett hesitated. "It is true that there was an unusual amendment shortly before Mrs. Hargrave's death. She instructed us to include provision for a John M. No surname. She told us we'd understand the reference when the time came." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And did she mention how this John M. was to be identified?" only that he would present proof, personal, not legal. She refused to elaborate. Has anyone approached you, claiming to bet this person? Yes, just this week, a Mr. John Marple said he was your son. In fact, Miss Marple's voice did not waver, I see. And have you begun any process of disbursement? Not yet. We were awaiting formal verification, but he seemed quite confident, and he produced a photograph of you holding a child. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The game was escalating. Whoever this man was, he was not just guessing. He had pieces, documents, letters, photographs. Either he had discovered something buried, or someone had supplied him with enough to make the lie believable. She stood. Thank you, Mr. Beckett. I believe I shall find my answers soon enough, and when I do, he shall make certain the right ones are written into the final pages. Beckett looked puzzled. Miss Marple. She turned back at the door. Did Mr. Marple mention how he came to find the photograph? Beckett shook his head. No, Buff did say this was the only home he had left to turn to. Miss Marple walked out into the street, the spring breeze lifting her scarf slightly. She did not believe in ghosts, nor in sudden signs, but she did believe in secrets, and someone was using hers, real or imagined, to play a dangerous game. Chapter for the grave that was disturbed. The graveyard behind St. Jude Church in Rose Hill was a quiet, wind-swept place. Overgrown ivy tangled day along the crumbling stone wall, and the headstones leaned gently in surrender. Time. This was a place that rarely drew attention, unless there was a burial, or more rarely an exhumation, and that was precisely what Arthur Stoneth, elderly gravedigger, found signs of when he came to trim the grass near the Hargrave. Familiar plat. One of the graves, Lydia Hargrave's, newly laid and still, marked with fresh soil, had been tampered with, not dug up completely, but disturbed. The edges of the earth were uneven, and the floral arrangement, placed not just a week earlier, was lying several feet away, petals crushed as though someone had stepped on them. More telling still was the faint imprint of rubber soles, not boots, pressed into the damp ground. Arthur leaned in, squinting, his knees cracking beneath him, too shallow for animals. He muttered to himself, and Norfolks makes tracks like that. He scratched his chin. Then, with his old bicycle wheeling beside him, he made straight for Inspector Cray at Devil Edge. Constabulary Cray was a broad man, built like a furnace, with a mustache that looked as though it had been trimmed with a bayonet. He was not fond of fuss, but when Arthur spoke, Cray listened. Are you certain? The inspector scathed. As certain as I am that my knees ache before a storm, Arthur replied. Someone's been poking about her grave, and it wasn't me or the wind. Within the hour, Cray and his constable were standing beside the grave with tape-and measuring sticks, murmuring like scientists at a crime scene. They didn't find much. No tools, no discarded gloves, but the disturbance. Wassendine, Ubel, and worse still, the soil wasn't level. Someone had moved something or placed something into the grave. But what? The cut. A village stirred by secrets. Chapter 5. Shadows of doubt. The village of Rose Hill hummed with unease as dusk settled over its cobblestone streets. A grave had been disturbed. A stranger had arrived, and whispers of a letter from the dead hinting at a possible inheritance whirled through teacups and church pews. One name surfaced repeatedly in hushed tones. Miss Marple. She must know more than she's letting on, muttered Ernest Bees, the hardware shop owner, polishing a wrench. Oh, she knows everything, replied Morwen Ellis, not lifting her eyes from her hymn book. At her cottage, Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table, folding laced handkerchiefs with deliberate care. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, circling the facts like a hawk over a field. A stranger, claiming to be her son, a forged narrative backed by photographs and a letter, a disturbed grave, and yet no direct confrontation, only implications. This was no amateur's work. It was calculated, steady. She decided it was time to step from the shadows. Wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, she made her way to the Crown and Feather. For the stranger, John Marple, had returned that afternoon and was reportedly dining alone. Inside the inn, a low fire crackled and the scent of beef stew hung in the air. Regulars hunched over tankards, glancing at Miss Marple as she entered. Mrs. Reeves raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. John Marple sat at the same corner table as before, looking up from his roast lamb as she approached. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "I wasn't sure I'd see you again. I imagine you hoped I wouldn't." He gestured to the empty chair. "Please, sit, if you'd like." She remained standing, hands folded over her bag. "I have a question," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Who gave you that photograph?" He hesitated, not with surprise, but with calculation. "A man in London," he replied. "He runs an archive of estate documents. Claimed to know Lydia. Said she passed him a box of personal effects before her death. It had the photo and a letter." "Did you see Lydia yourself?" "No, Maria Avenue 11th, 2025 system." "No," he said plainly. "I never claimed to be her son. Only that she wrote as though she and you made an arrangement that you bore a child, and she took care of the matter." Miss Marple's eyes didn't waver. "You speak like someone who's rehearsed." John smiled faintly. "You're a remarkable woman, but even remarkable people have secrets, not the kind you're fabricating." She reached into her bag and produced a copy of the letter she'd received that morning. "Did this come from the same man?" He studied it for a long moment. "Yes, that handwriting. I've seen it before." She tucked the letter away. "You've been clever," she said, turning to leave, "but not clever enough." He stood. "I didn't come here to deceive you." "Then why did someone disturb Lydia's grave last night?" she asked. He paled. "I don't know what you mean, don't you?" she said, pausing at the door before stepping into the night. By morning, Rose Hill was on edge. Inspector Cray had posted 2 constables at the churchyard. Mrs. Featherston patrolled the village with her knitting, eavesdropping as only she could. The vicar prepared a sermon on truth. And the bank manager was rechecking Lydia Hargrave's accounts for suspicious activity. Miss Marple, however, was in her garden, clipping lavender. When the postman delivered a telegram at 10:43 a.m., she accepted it without surprise. To Jane Marple, Rose Hill, village records found. No listing of childbirth or adoption in your name. However, curiosity, L. Hargrave, listed as emergency guardian for J.M., male infant. No date of death, no record of transfer. Strange gap. Investigating further. Simpson, Bath Archive Smiths. Marple read the note, her gaze drifting across her garden. The birds chirped, the breeze swayed the trees, but nothing was as it seemed. There had been a baby not hers, and perhaps not Lydia's either. Someone had slipped into the records, altered details, and woven a lie from forgotten pieces. But why tie Lydia's name to a falsehood? She turned toward the road leading to the vicarage. Something was missing, but not for long. Chapter 6. Secrets. Beneath St. Jude's church stood at Rose Hill's heart, its weathered bell tower casting long shadows over the gravestones. Generations had passed beneath its slate roof, marriages, funerals, christenings, confessions. It was the village's heartbeat, with chambers never meant to be opened. That morning, Miss Marple visited the church, not for prayer, but for evidence. She nodded to the curate, sweeping the path, and requested to see Reverend Potter. The vicar, an aging man with thin hair and ink-stained cuffs, welcomed her into his study, where papers teetered in stacks and pipe tobacco lingered in the air. Was hoping. Miss Marple began to examine your parish ledgers, particularly baptism and guardianship records from 1931 to 1933. You don't mean this is about that business with the grave? Pottle asked, raising a bushy brow in a manner of speaking. Well, he huffed, standing with effort there in the lower vestry, but mind your head dreadfully low. He led her down a narrow stone stair behind the altar, through a passage lit by flickering lamps, to a heavy oak door. Beyond it lay St. Jude's archives, cool and musty, with dust swirling in slants of light from high, narrow windows. Shelves held oilskin-wrapped documents and faded folders. An iron cabinet stood in the corner. Pottle handed her a ring of brass keys. Take all the time you need, Miss Marple. I'll be upstairs if you need stronger reading glasses. Thanked him and set to work, starting with the 1932 baptismal register. She flipped through neat entries. January 3rd, Lillian Cooper. February 11th, Thomas Michael Graves. March 28th blank, an entry with only initials, J.M., no parents listed. A note read, private guardianship authorized by Reverend D. Withers. Infant, healthy. No further instruction. Her mouth tightened. She checked the guardianship register. There, in Reverend Withers' angular hand, May 1932. Lydia Hargrave, temporary guardian of male infant, J.M., no surname. Origin, St. Catherine's Hospital, Bath. Duration, indefinite. Miss Marple exhaled. There had been a child, neither hers nor Lydia's, by birth. The hospital had transferred an infant, likely an orphan, to Lydia's care. She had raised him, or sent him elsewhere. But why hide it unless she was concealing something deeper? In the lower cabinet, among burial receipts and floral invoices, she found an anomaly. July 1932. Grave prepared under supervision of Reverend Withers. Name, J.M. infant. Cause stillbirth, recorded late. Note, body not inspected, per guardian's request to avoid autopsy. Miss Marple stared. The child was listed as stillborn, but no doctor had confirmed it. No death certificate existed. Inquested, her breath caught. Had Lydia falsified the child's death? Upstairs, Pottle was polishing a candlestick. Did you find what you were looking for? He asked gently. In part, she replied, though it raises questions like why a child was listed as stillborn when he may well have lived. Pottle looked alarmed. That would be a terrible breach of church and civil law. An act of desperation, she said softly, or compassion, perhaps both. That afternoon, Inspector Cray waited outside her gate, looking uneasy. Miss Marple, he said, tipping his hat. Sorry to trouble you, but something's happened. She gestured to the garden bench. I'm listening. Cray didn't sit. His discomfort was unusual for a man who scolded sergeants while buttering toast. There's been a break-in, he said. Where? Your cousin, Lydia's old cottage, the one she led to tenants. It's been empty since January. No furniture, utilities. But someone broke the window, rifled through what was left of her desk, and we found something, or rather the constable did, hidden under a floorboard. It's a small wooden box. He held it out. Miss Marple took it carefully. The box was old, carved with the initials L.H. She opened the latch. Inside were a few yellowed photographs and a diary. It was bound in cracked leather and smelled faintly of dust and roses. On the first page, Lydia had written in a flowing, careful script, for the day I am no longer here, truth must out. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she turned. The next page, the entries began in April 1932. One line caught her attention immediately. The baby is not Jane's. She does not know. She never knew. They brought him to the hospital under her name and heir. I couldn't tell her, not after all she had suffered. Miss Marple stopped reading the truth, crashed down like a wave it had been a clerical marathon. Baby born to another woman had been temporarily labeled under her name, Jane Marple Patience, next of kin, because of an administrative VIP she had been. They're visiting Lydia, not for herself, but in that brief confusion, the hospital had passed the child to Lydia Astrek, with sudden emotion perhaps. Even loneliness had accepted him, had kept Hyman when he fell ill or disappeared or was hidden. She had buried his name and told no one until now, until someone found the truth. Someone who wanted more than answers. Someone who wanted money, identity, legacy, and the man calling himself John Marple had all the pieces, except the one that mattered most. The Truth, Chapter 6, The Man Who Knew Too Much About Her Life. The next morning began with a startling silence, not the comforting hush of a quiet English village, but the kind that comes just before a storm breaks, where the birds forget to sing, and even Thewand holds his breath. Miss Marple felt it the moment opened her curtains. The air in Rosehill had changed, and so had the mood at precisely 8:15 a.m. A knock came at the door. She expected, perhaps, Reverend Pottle or Constable Franks with another mess from Inspector Cray. But it wasn't either of them, it was John Marple. He stood there as if summoned by the day itself, hat in hand, eyes clouded by sleeplessness, but still composed. I thought it time we spoke again, he said. May I come in, miss? Marple nodded, once turned and led him to the sitting room without a word. Clementine, her cat, took one look at him, hissed softly, and leaped Tonto the windowsill. John gave a faint tired laugh. Animals can sense things, can't they? More often than people suspect. Miss Marple replied, settling into her chair now. Then Mr. Marple, or should I call you something else? He sat the question, floating between them. You found the diary. Say it simply. I expected you would. I knew Lydia had hidden it. I didn't know where, but I knew she'd left some explanation behind. Indeed, Miss Marple said, you've been quite clever. Not clever enough to fool me permanently, but enough to stir it out. I'd like to know why. John looked at his hands, nodded together in his lap. Denny met her gaze with an honesty so raw she almost Chapter 7. John Marple believed it. Because I don't know who I am, he said. Miss Marple blinked. What do you mean? I was raised in a home in Bath. One of those places where children come and go like ghosts in hallways. I never knew me parents, but I remembered one thing. Always my birth bracelet, the kind they put on babies in hospital. It had initials, JMI. Carried it with me everywhere until it broke, and when I was older, I went searching. He took a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her. It was a photocopy of an old hospital intercarricord. Infant male, no name, mother's name, temporarily listed as Jane Marple, April 1903, to St. Catherine's Hospital, Bath. Miss Marple took the paper, gently stared at it, and so, she said slowly, you believed I might be your mother. I didn't know, he said. I had no real hope of it, but when I found Lydia Targrave Listidas, my guardian in church records, and then, later, when I found the photograph, it felt like fate was giving me answers. Did you not wonder? She asked softly, why someone would list a name in error on an infant's records. He nodded. I did, but I was desperate to belong somewhere, Miss Marple. I said nothing. For a long time the tea tray between them had gone cold in the will. She asked, when did that come into it? He hesitated. 6 months ago I received a letter from a man in London, claimed to be an archivist, said he'd traced Anastate. Lydia's connected to my name, said it was my birthright, and all I needed to do was prove I was her ward. When I asked why he was helping me, he said he had his reasons. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. What was his name? I only knew him as Collins. He always wore gloves. Even in summer that name chilled her. She remembered it now. Rupert Collins. I named that. had appeared in one of Lydia's old letters years ago. A cousin of Lydia Slade's husband, a man said to be quite skilled with forged documents and twice arrested on suspicion of fraud, though never convicted. Did you know, she said carefully, that the grave behind St. Jude's marked for you was likely fabricated? That your death was faked on paper so the child could vanish quiet? John nodded. And yet, here I am. But are you him? She asked Theobie. Lydia took in. He looked down. I don't know the dates, but the initials fit. The home matched the address of the orphanage listed in the parish files, but by it, that nothing. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. And still, you came here climbing to be my son. He looked up again, and this time, there was no anger, only pain. I came here because I wanted to belong, and because someone promised Mead fine answers. Instead, I've only found ghosts later. That day, Inspector Cray visited Miss Marple's cottage, hat in hand. We are making progress, he said. Turns out, your friend, Mr. Collins, if that's his real name, booked a room in Truro under the alias Tier Howard, disappeared to Diasago, left behind a bag of forged documents, including a second will and a blank birth certificate with your name typed at the top. Miss Marple shook her head. It's all a game to him, constructing identities like Pappy and Mary. The good news, Craig continued, is that we've got enough to pursue charges fraud, conspiracy, and possibly obstruction of justice. We're putting out a wider alert. I doubt he'll show his face again. Miss Marple walked him to the gate. Thank you, Inspector. One more thing, Cray added, pouncing at the rose bush too. You believe him, this young man? She considered this for a long moment. I believe, she said finally, that he may be telling the truth. Perhaps not all of it. He wants to believe he belongs, and perhaps he does, but not to me. Craig tipped his hat. You're a difficult one to fool, Miss Marple, only because people lie in such familiar ways. She replied. That evening, John Marple left the village, not in shame, not in anger, just in silence. He left a short note at Miss Marple's gate. Thank you for your kindness, even when I didn't deserve it. I hope one day I'll know who I am, and that when I, Doyle, make peace with it. John, Miss Marple, stood at the gate as sun dipped below the hills. She watched the road where his figure had vanished. She didn't wave. She didn't cry, but she felt something strange in her chest. A grief, exactly. Not relief either. Something like the echo of a child never born. Or maybe somewhere once held in the arms of fate and forgotten. Chapter 7. The woman who remembered too much. Miss Marple spent the following days quietly mulling over everything that had transpired. Key, the mystery surrounding the strangers, claimed forged documents. Key, the grave that had been disturbed. All of it had begun to settle into a quiet unease, like a storm that had passed but left the air still thick with its weight. But as always, the answers Miss Marple sought were not to be found in any single event. They were hidden in patterns, the patterns people followed, the ones they left behind, the ones they tried so hard to erase on the morning after John Marple's departure. Miss Marple found herself standing in the village cemetery, once again, this time not for an investigation but for a far more personal reason. It was early, and the mist still clung. Tough gravestones, like an unspoken secret. The bell had not yet rung for morning service, and the churchyard was completely still. She stopped before Chapter 8, Evelyn Coulson's more unassuming headstone. Lydia Hargrave's Tudisha stone was newly set, a simple inscription marking her birth, her marriage, and her death. But Miss Marple had known Lydia long before the name was etched in stone. She could still hear Lydia's voice, sharp with intelligence and occasional wit, always at odds with burdens. She carried the grave was not the only thing Miss Marple had come to visit that morning. She was waiting for someone, and at that moment she saw her approach. The one person who might have answers to the questions that lingered even after the stranger stepped at her. It was Evelyn Colson, a village widow in her late 70s, with a slow, deliberate gait and eyes that had seen far too much. She was known to be a bit of an old gossip, a relic of another era, who prided herself on remembering Tea, especially the things most people wished to forget. Morning, Jane, Evelyn said, her voice raspy from age and too much time spent in the cold. She smiled faintly, as though offering a kind of apology for her sudden appearance. Good morning, Evelyn, Miss Marple replied, looking down at the gravestone. I had a feeling you'd come. Evelyn squinted, her eyes flicking toward the gravestone. Yes, I've been wondering when you'd figure it out. Figure what out? Everything, all of it. The child, the mammoth, lies. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. You know something about this, Evelyn? Not it though. She was slow to speak, choosing her words as carefully as someone walking through another. There's been a break-in, he said. Where? Your cousin Lydia's old cottage, the one she led to tenants. It's been empty since January. No furniture, utilities. But someone broke the window, rifled through what was left of her desk, and we found something, or rather the constable did, hidden under a floorboard. It's a small wooden box. He held it out. Miss Marple took it carefully. The box was old, carved with the initials LH. She opened the latch. Inside were a few yellowed photographs and a diary. It was bound in cracked leather and smelled faintly of dust and roses. On the first page, Lydia had written in a flowing, careful script, for the day I am no longer here, truth must out. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she turned. The next page, the entries began in April 1932. One line caught her attention immediately. The baby is not Jane's. She does not know. She never knew. They brought him to the hospital under her name and air. I couldn't tell her, not after all she had suffered. Miss Marple stopped reading. The truth crashed down like a wave. It had been a clerical error. Baby born to another woman had been temporarily labeled under her name, Jane Marple, Patience, next of kin, because of an administrative VIP she had been. They're visiting Lydia, not for herself, but in that brief confusion, the hospital had passed the child to Lydia Astruc, with sudden emotion perhaps. Even loneliness had accepted him, had kept Hyman when he fell ill or disappeared or was hidden. She had buried his name and told no one until now, until someone found the truth. Someone who wanted more than answers. Someone who wanted money, identity, legacy, and the man calling himself John Marple had all the pieces, except the one that mattered most. The Truth, Chapter 6, The Man Who Knew Too Much About Her Life. The next morning began with a startling silence, not the comforting hush of a quiet English village, but the kind that comes just before a storm breaks, where the birds forget to sing, and even the wind holds its breath. Miss Marple felt it the moment opened her curtains. The air in Rosehill had changed, and so had the mood. At precisely 8:15 a.m. a knock came at the door. She expected perhaps Reverend Pottle or Constable Franks with another mess from Inspector Cray. But it wasn't either of them. It was John Marple. He stood there as if summoned by the day itself, hat in hand, eyes clouded by sleeplessness, but still composed. I thought it time we spoke again, he said. May I come in, miss? Marple nodded, once turned and led him to the sitting room without a word. Clementine, her cat, took one look at him, hissed softly, and leaped onto the windowsill. John gave a faint tired law. Animals can sense things, can't they? More often than people suspect. Miss Marple replied, settling into her chair now. Then Mr. Marple, or should I call you something else? He sat the question, floating between them. You found the diary. Say it simply. I expected you would. I knew Lydia had hidden it. I didn't know where, but I knew she'd left some explanation behind. Indeed, Miss Marple said, you've been quite clever. Not clever enough to fool me permanently, but enough to stir it out. I'd like to know why. John looked at his hands, nodded to gather in his lap. Denny met her gaze with an honesty so raw she almost chapped her 7. John Marple believed it. Because I don't know who I am, he said. Miss Marple blinked. What do you mean? I was raised in a home in Bath. Own of those places where children come and go like ghosts in hallways. I never knew me parents, but I remembered one thing. Always my birth bracelet, the kind they put on babies in hospital. It had initials, JMI. Carried it with me everywhere until it broke, and when I was older, I went searching. He took a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her. It was a photocopy of an old hospital intercare record. Infant male, no name, mother's name, temporarily listed as Jane Marple, April 1903 to St. Catherine's Hospital, Bath. Miss Marple took the paper, gently stared at it, and so, she said slowly, you believed I might be your mother. I didn't know, he said. I had no real hope of it, but when I found Lydia Targrave Listidas, my guardian in church records, and then, later, when I found the photograph, it felt like fate was giving me answers. Did you not wonder? She asked softly, why someone would list a name in error on an infant's records. He nodded. I did, but I was desperate to belong somewhere. Miss Marple said nothing. For a long time the tea tray between them had gone cold in the will. She asked, when did that come into it? He hesitated. 6 months ago I received a letter from a man in London, claimed to be an archivist, said he'd traced anestate. Lydia's connected to my name, said it was my birthright, and all I needed to do was prove I was her ward. When I asked why he was helping me, he said he had his reasons. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. What was his name? I only knew him as Collins. He always wore gloves, even in summer. That name chilled her. She remembered it now. Rupert Collins, a name that had appeared in one of Lydia's old letters years ago. A cousin of Lydia Slade's husband, a man said to be quite skilled with forged documents and twice arrested on suspicion of fraud, though never convicted. Did you know, she said carefully, that the grave behind St. Jude's marked for you was likely fabricated? That your death was faked on paper so the child could vanish quiet? John nodded. And yet, here I am. But are you him? She asked Theobie. Lydia took in. He looked down. I don't know the dates, fit the initials fit. The home matched the address of the orphanage listed in the parish files, but beyond that nothing. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. And still, you came here climbing to be my son. He looked up again, and this time, there was no anger, only pain. I came here because I wanted to belong, and because someone promised Mead fine answers. Instead, I've only found ghosts later. That day Inspector Cray visited Miss Marple's cottage hat in hand. We are making progress, he said. Turns out, your friend, Mr. Collins, if that's his real name, booked a room in Truro under the alias Dear Howard, disappeared to Diasago, left behind a bag of forged documents, including a second will and a blank birth certificate with your name typed at the top. Miss Marple shook her head. It's all a game to him, constructing identities like Pappy and Mary. The good news, Craig continued, is that we've got enough to pursue charges fraud, conspiracy, and possibly obstruction of justice. We're putting out a wider alert. I doubt he'll show his face again. Miss Marple walked into the gate. Thank you, Inspector. One more thing, Cray added pouncing at the rose bush too. You believe him, this young man? She considered this for a long moment. I believe, she said finally, that he may be telling the truth. Perhaps not all of it. He wants to believe he belongs, and perhaps he does, but not to me. Craig tipped his hat. You're a difficult one to fool, Miss Marple, only because people lie in such familiar ways. She replied. That evening, John Marple left the village, not in shame, not in anger, just in silence. He left a short note at Miss Marple's gate. Thank you for your kindness, even when I didn't deserve it. I hope one day I'll know who I am, and that when I, Doyle, make peace with it. John, Miss Marple, stood at the gate as sun dipped below the hills. She watched the road where his figure had vanished. She didn't wave. She didn't cry, but she felt something strange in her chest. A grief, exactly. Not relief either. Something like the echo of a child never born. Or maybe somewhere once held in the arms of fate and forgotten. Chapter 7. The woman who remembered too much. Miss Marple spent the following days quietly mulling over everything that had transpired. Key, the mystery surrounding the strangers, claimed forged documents. Key, the grave that had been disturbed. All of it had begun to settle into a quiet unease, like a storm that had passed but left the air still thick with its weight. But as always, the answers Miss Marple sought were not to be found in any single event. They were hidden in patterns, the patterns people followed, the ones they left behind, the ones they tried so hard to erase on the morning after John Marple's departure. Miss Marple found herself standing in the village cemetery, once again, this time not for an investigation but for a far more personal reason. It was early and the mist still clung. Tough gravestones, like an unspoken secret. The bell had not yet rung for morning service, and the churchyard was completely still. She stopped before Chapter 8, Evelyn Coulson's more unassuming headstone. Lydia Hargrave's Tudisha stone was newly set, a simple inscription marking her birth, her marriage, and her death. But Miss Marple had known Lydia long before the name was etched in stone. She could still hear Lydia's voice, sharp with intelligence and occasional wit, always at odds with burdens. She carried the grave was not the only thing Miss Marple had come to visit that morning. She was waiting for someone, and at that moment she saw her approach. The one person who might have answers to the questions that lingered even after the stranger stepped at her. It was Evelyn Coulson, a village widow in her late 70s, with a slow, deliberate gait and eyes that had seen far too much. She was known to be a bit of an old gossip, a relic of another era, who prided herself on remembering jabbering tea, especially the things most people wished to forget. Morning, Jane, Evelyn said, her voice raspy from age and too much time spent in the cold. She smiled faintly, as though offering a kind of apology for her sudden appearance. Good morning, Evelyn, Miss Marple replied, looking down at the gravestone. I had a feeling you'd come. Evelyn squinted, her eyes flicking toward the gravestone. Yes, I've been wondering when you'd figure it out. Figure what out? Everything, all of it. The child, the Namath, lies. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. You know something about this, Evelyn? Not it though. She was slow to speak, choosing her words as carefully as someone walking through a minefield. It wasn't just the grave that was disturbed. You know, she said, her voice dropping. Lydia, okay, she had a lot of secrets, and I don't think she wanted Toady with them. Miss Marple waited, motioning for Evelyn to continue. She was a good woman, Lydia. Evelyn continued, stepping closer, her eyes flickering nervously. But she had a certain history. And the man who came asking about her, that John Morrow, you were right to be suspicious. I don't think he's lying, but I don't think he's telling the full truth either. What do you mean? Miss Marple pressed. Evelyn hesitated, taking a deep breath. Before speaking in a hushed tone, there were rumors back when Lydia and her husband were living in that big house near the cliffs. I worked for them for a time, cleaning and running errands, and I remember before they moved to the coast, there was a child, a little boy, about the same time Lydia started getting ill. Lydia was ill, Miss Marple lisped. Her interest piqued. Yes, Evelyn said slowly. No one really knew what was wrong with her. She would disappear for weeks, and when she came back, she looked frail. She couldn't bear children, you see, but I think she wanted one badly. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained silent, waiting. There was talk. Evelyn went on about her going to a doctor, a specialist in London. She even had some surgery and operation. After that, she seemed better, but not long after, there was talk of an adoption, or perhaps it was a privateeragement. No one knew exactly, but I overheard Lydia talking to Samiona, possibly her late husband, about the child. It was a secret. Miss Marple felt the weight of Fiblin's words settle like a stone in her chest. Evelyn, you're saying there was another child? Mr. Marple asked, almost breathless. Evelyn nodded yes. I never saw him, mind you, but the rumors were strong he was supposed to have been sent away to a family member, or maybe an institution. But after that, Lydia began to act strange. I always thought she regretted something she never said aloud. Miss Marple's mind began to race, sorting through the fragments of past, connecting them in ways she hadn't yet understood. The letter she had received, the one signed with Lydia's initials, took on a new significance. Do you know where the child went? Miss Marple asked, her voice tight with urgency. Evelyn shook her head. I never found out, but after Lydia passed, I overheard some of the staff talking. They said the boy was gone. They thought he was dead even. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. And Lydia, she ever mentioned anything about him before she died? Evelyn hesitated. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. There was something, Evelyn said softly, a few weeks before Lydia passed. She spoke to me about a letter, one she'd written, she said, shed, to get the truth out before it was too late. She never showed it to me. Tough. A letter, Miss Marple repeated. Evelyn's face grew clouded with memories. She said, it was for someone she couldn't trust, a man from London. He was supposed to help her, but she had doubts. I think she knew something wasn't right. Miss Marple's mind was racing now. The pieces were falling into place. She turned to Evelyn. Thank you for telling me this, but where is this letter now? Evelyn shook her head slowly. I don't know, but I have a feeling the answers lie in the attic of Lydia's old home. You'll find what you need there. Miss Marple wasted no time. By the afternoon, she was standing before the old house, near the cliffs, Lydia Hargrave's former residence. The ever-covered structure, once grand and inviting, now stood, stark and unkempt, like a forgotten relic of the past. She walked up to the front door, where a rusty key was waiting for her, hidden in the usual place behind the loose brick, and she stepped inside. Thea felt thick with dust, the floors creaking beneath her feet upstairs. The attic door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for her. Inside, the room was dim-backed. The scent of old leather and paper filled the air. She began to search. It wasn't long before she found it, a small, leather-bound journal, tucked between old boxes and forgotten trunks. With trembling hands, Miss Marple penned the first page. Hey, the handwriting was unmistakable, Lydia's. It began, to the one who finds this, I must confess the truth of what has been buried, a secret I can no longer carry. For you must know, it is not just me legacy at stake. It is someone else's life, someone who deserves the truth. Miss Marple continued, reading her mind, absorbing each word as it depends. Mystery she had already begun to unravel there in the pages of Chana. Keys's last confession was everything she had been searching for. Everything, it seemed, had been a lie. Chapter 8, the final key. To the truth, the journal in Miss Marple's hands seemed heavier. With each page, she turned as though the truth itself was pressing against her, waiting to break free. Each line she read unraveled another piece of the complex web Lydia Hargrave had woven it. Her desperate attempt to hide the past, the air and the attic, grew thick as the shadows shifted, and Miss Marple felt for the first time in many years the weight of a mystery, one that had begun long before she had ever set foot in Rose Hill. The journal was a confession, but it wasn't just about a hidden child. It was about guilt and love and the many faces of shame. Lydia had been more than just a cousin to Miss Marple. She had been a partner in the long, difficult process of survival after the war. They had both carried the scars of loss, but Lydia had borne hers insolence. It wasn't until the entries in this journal that Miss Marple truly understood how much of Lydia's life had been a carefully constructed facade. The first entry was dated April 1932, right after the baby had been transferred to Lydia's care. I cannot keep him. He is not mine. They brought him to me by mistake or by design. But I will keep him for as long as I must. I can't bear the thought of giving him up. Not after all I've lost. I cannot face the truth. I don't know what to do. Jane will never know. She must never know. She has suffered enough, and I will suffer too. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the page. Jane will never know. Lydia had never once mentioned a child to her, not one scene all their years together, but now it was clear Lydia had borne the weight off this secret alone. She had taken the child, raised him as her own, and buried it. Truth beneath layers of silence. As Miss Marple continued reading the entries became darker. I've told him lies. I've told him he is my son, but he's not. The truth is too painful. He will never know the real reason why I took him in. He will never know what happened to his real mother, to his real family. It was an accident, a mistake that has haunted me every day since. The truth began to emerge in fragments, broken pieces of the past that had been carefully buried. Miss Marple's heart began to beat fast as the final pages unfolded. It was not an accident that I took him in. I saw a chance to heal, to fill the void that had been left in me. I thought that by raising him, I could somehow right the wrongs of my own past. But the truth is, EOM, not his mother, and I will never be. There was a time when I thought I could protect him from the world, but now I know that I have only protected myself. Eve kept the truth locked away for him, for Jane, for everyone, but I cannot keep it any longer. The final entry was dated July 1932. I will write to Jane now. Tell her the truth. The baby was never hers. He was never mine, but he deserves to know who he is, and Tana live with a lie any longer. I will tell her everything, and maybe, just maybe, she will forgive me. But there was no letter, no record of such a confession being made. Lydia had never sent it. She had never told Miss Marple. Miss Marple closed the journal slowly and exhaled deeply. Lydia had made a terrible decision, one that had impacted not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. She had taken in a child, not her own, raised him as if he were hers, and created a world of lies to protect them both. But there was one thing Miss Marple knew for certain. Now Lydia's secret wasn't just about her. It was about the boy. The boy who had been raised in the shadow of a lie, never knowing the truth of his origins, never knowing who Harali was. And he had come to Rose Hill seeking answers that had eluded him for his entire life. The man who had claimed to be her son, John Marple, was not her son at all. He was the child of another woman, but somewhere in the convoluted maze of confusion and secrecy, he had come to believe that he belonged to her. It was not just a case of mistaken identity. It was a case of Samianetta's prey for belonging. That afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Inspector Cray once more. She had learned what she needed to know from Lydia's journal, but the final steps remained. The truth needed to come to light, not just for her, but for the man who had wandered into her life and called himself her son. The constable at the door let her in without hesitation, as Miss Marple was known to all of them. Inspector Cray stood behind his desk, sorting through the pile of paperwork that had accumulated over the week. He paused when I saw her enter. You're looking pensive, Miss Marple, Cray remarked, setting down the files. I've come to offer you the final piece of the puzzle, Inspector, as Miss Marple said. Quietly, Cray raised an eyebrow but gestured to the chair. Go ahead. She placed Lydia's journal on the desk, the weight of it far heavier than it seemed. I believe she began that you are looking for someone who doesn't exist. Craig frowned, but his interest was piqued. I beg. Your pardon, the man who claimed to be my son, Miss Marple, continued. His name is not John Marple. He is not related to me at all, but he believes, no. He desperately wants to believe that he is because me in his search for meaning. Someone told him that he was. She paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to sink in this child. This man was not the son of Lydia Hargrave. He was the son of a woman who gave him up, perhaps sunk knowingly, and that woman's name was never written anywhere. Miss Marple took a deep breath, but what Lydia Hargrave could not bring herself to admit is that she did, in fact, raise him. She did it in silence, in these shadows of her own guilt, and she made him believe that he was someone he was not. Craig listened, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed her words. And the gravidisturbance, another lie of feigned death. The inspector leaned back in his chair. But why go to all this trouble to hide the truth? Miss Marple said, simply to protect a secret one that wasn't just hers, but someone else's. The days went on, the pieces finally began to settle into place. Craig's team continued to investigate Collins, the mysterious archivist who had spurred the chain of events leading to John Marple's arrival. They discovered that Collins had connections to old criminal circles, but no that seemed to explain his involvement in this case. The village of Rose Hill began to to its normal rhythms, but Miss Marple could never quite escape the feeling of weight in her chest, the uncomfortable realization that the most dangerous lies are often those we tell ourselves. When John Marple left Rose Hill for the final time, Miss Marple did not bid him farewell. She watched from her window as he walked down the lane, his shoulders slumped with the weight of the past he would never fully understand. The truth, it seemed, was always more complicated than we wish it to be, and some questions were better left tunes were. Chapter 9, The Last Confession of Lydia Hargrave. The days following John Marple's departure from Rose Hill were marked by a strange quiet that Miss Marple had grown used to over the years. The village returned to its familiar rhythm, but there was something lingering in the air. A sense of unease that, though unspoken, sat on the shoulders of those who had borne witness to the strange events. But for Miss Marple, there was no peace yet. She had resolved many of the facts. Of course, she knew now that John Marple was not her son, nor was he truly Lydia Hargrave's, but that didn't make the situation any less complicated. He was a man who had been raised under false pretenses, who had believed in a lie his entire life, and though the truth had been revealed to him, the damage had already been done. Delusions had taken root, but there was still one thing left to do, one final act to complete. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Miss Marple made her way to the local solicitor's office. Grantham and Beckett, the same office that had handled Lydia Hargrave's will. She walked with the deliberate steps, the weight of Lydia's final journal heavy in her bag, tucked safely beneath her coat. She had made an appointment earlier that week, and today was the day she would uncover the last piece of the puzzle. Bell above the door jingled as entered, and the receptionist, Sarah, smiled politely. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Mr. Grantham is expecting you. Please write this way." Miss Marple nodded and followed her down the narrow hallway to the solicitor's office. Mr. Grantham, a thin, bespectacled man with an air of perpetual surprise, was sitting behind his desk, flipping through some papers. When she entered, "Oh, Miss Marple," he said with a start, as if he had been expecting someone else entirely. "Please come in. Can I offer you some tea?" "No, thank you," Miss Marple replied, sitting across from him. She placed the journal on the desk between them. "I've come to discuss the final details of Lydia Hargrave's estate," she said, her voice calm but firm. Grantham frowned slightly, though his professional smile didn't waver. "Of course, we've completed most of the paperwork, but I understand there were some complications with the will that I haven't had the chance to fully explain." "Complications?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Yes, well, there were some changes made shortly before Mrs. Hargrave's passing. As I mentioned in our previous meetings, made a provision for an heir at John Marple, but there were no clear instructions about what should happen with the estate. In the event of a contested claim, Miss Marple's pulse quickened. What does that mean, contested? Well, there was an unusable stipulation in the will. Grantham continued, folding his hands de estatoise to be divided evenly between the named heir, Mr. Marple, and the residual beneficiaries, but only if the heir could prove they were indeed Mrs. Hargrave's child. Not the entire estate would revert to the charity fund she had created for local children. Miss Marple's mind raced, so the estate was at stake. Grantham nodded precisely, and because Mr. Marple was unable to provide sufficient evidence of his parental claims, we've had to make certain arrangements. Miss Marple glanced down at the journal, her fingers brushing over its worn surface. The answer had been here along. Lydia had known the truth. She had even planned for the possibility that it would one day be uncovered. Tosk, Grantham said, his voice hesitant, but is there any chance you might have information regarding the identity of Mr. Marple's biological mother? Miss Marple looked up sharply. What exactly do you mean by that? Well, you see, Grantham continued, there isn't Mr. Marple's claim is in question is because we can find no official record of his birth mother despite the hospital records we have on file. Marcharker's notes indicate a temporary guardianship, but there's no official record of the child's origins. We've tried to investigate further, but that trail has gone cold. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. You've tried to investigate, but no one has asked the right questions. Grantham blinked. What do you mean? Miss Marple said with acquiescence, but steely resolve that the child was never meant to be part of Lydia Harker's estate at all. He was a product of something far older and darker as Gret, buried long before he ever arrived in Rose Hill. Lydia's own grief and fear of facing the past kept her from acknowledging the truth. She slid the journal toward him. I came to tell you, Mr. Grantham, that man who walked into this village is not the son of Lydia Hargrave. He is the product of a scandal that Lydia could never bear to speak of. His biological mother is someone who doesn't want to be found, and that secret is more important than the inheritance. Grantham stared at the journal, his eyes widening. Are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple interrupted, that Lydia kept the truth hidden for the sake of everyone involved. She took the child and raised him as her own and protected him from the reality of his origins, but the truth was never hers to give. It was never anyone's target. For the first time in their conversation, Grantham appeared genuinely shaken. He reached for the journal, but Miss Marple was quicker. This isn't just about the estate, Mr. Grantham, she said, her voice cold and deliberate. This is about the truth. And sometimes the truth is the most difficult thing of all. Tunk over, but Lydia Hargrave knew it, and now it's time for the rest of us to face it. By evening, the village had begun to whisper again. The constables were collected to Lydia Hargrave's house, this time to search it for more evidence. And for the first time, the villagers were beginning to see the full picture. The lies, the half-truths, and the mysteries buried beneath the layers of false assumptions. As for Miss Marple, she knew there was one more question to answer, one that no one had thought to ask. Who in the end would claim Lydia Hargrave's legacy? It wouldn't be John Marple, but there was still someone who had a right to the estate, someone whose claim had been forgotten, overlooked. Asami, who had lived with the shadow of a lie for far too long. As Miss Marple walked home that evening, she could hear the church bells ringing softly in the distance. She paused for a moment, looking out across the village. It was a beautiful, quiet evening, but the weight of the mystery still hung in the air. She had uncovered the truth, she had solved the puzzle, and now it was time for the village to learn what it had been hiding all along. Chapter 10, The Final Resolution. The following morning, Rose Hill was alive with anticipation. The village, which had long prided itself on its peaceful rhythms, was now gripped by a collective tension. It seemed to hold the air still as Miss Marple made her way through the cobbled streets. She was aware of the murmurs that followed her, quiet but persistent, like a distant hum beneath. The usual chatter news of the disturbances at Lydia Hargrave's house had spread quickly, as had the details of the latest infestation. The solicitor's office had been busy drafting a letter to the official beneficiaries of Lydia's estate, and Miss Marple had been informed that the final details were set to be revealed that very afternoon. The Crown and Feather was more crowded than usual that morning. Villagers gathered in small clumps, each waiting to hear what would come of the mystery that had held Rose Hill in its grip for so long. John Marple had left the village 2 days ago, had somehow become both a symbol of confusion and tragedy. A man who had wanted answers but found only more questions. Miss Marple had already received word from Inspector Cray. The authorities had been investigating the claims in earnest. Now, they had a clearer picture of what had transpired. The child who had been placed with Lydia Hargrave, the so-called John Marple, was not the son of Miss Marple, nor was he the child of Lydia, though he had believed himself to be so. His real mother, the one who had abandoned him, remained a shadow, and the past, her name, still hidden. Yet the one thing no one had anticipated, the one truth that had remained buried, was about to surface. Miss Marple had one final task to complete. She made her way to the bike garage where Reverend Potter was finishing up his morning prayers. The vicar greeted her with the usual warmth, though there was a certain hesitancy in his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice soft, "I must admit, I never expected this to be the outcome." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "No one ever does, Reverend, but we must accept the truth, no matter how painful." The two sat in the small study where the scent of old wood and parchment filled the air. The conversation between them was brief but poignant. "It seems that Lydia Hargrave's legacy is now in the hands of someone you hope has no claim to it, and yet someone who has always had the right to it," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "There is another child, another heir, who has never been recognized. Child of Lydia's blood, born not of this village, but tied to it nonetheless. Reverend Potter blinked in confusion. Another heir. Miss Marple pinned her hand back and handed him a worn envelope. Inside was an official letter from Bath Hospital, dated several weeks prior, confirming that the child in question, the one born in 1932, had been identified as the biological child of Lydia Hargrave. The child's mother, who had been listed as Jane Marple in hospital records, was, in fact, Miss Marple's own sister, Martha Marple, who had died during childbirth. Miss Marple took a deep breath. My sister Martha was never mentioned in the official records. Her death was a source of great pain for our family, and Lydia promised to keep it dying. She raised the child in secret, not as her own, but as the son of my late sister, and when it came time to claim him, he was sent away, hidden in these shadows. The Reverend stared at the letter in disbelief. But it means that John Marple, the man who came to this village claiming to be my son, is not my son at all. Miss Marple continued. He is the son of my late sister, Martha, and it seems that Lydia Hargrave in her own way took him in and raised him as part of a family he never knew. Reverend Potter nodded, slowly processing things. Waited for words, so he has no claim to the estate, and yet he is the true heir. Exactly, Miss Marple replied, but there is still the matter of the truth. The estate, which Lydia intended to pass on, belongs to him. They are our heir, not to John Marple. The man who was so desperate to believe in Allie that afternoon, Inspector Cray, called a meeting at the Crown and Feather to make the official announcement. The villagers, as expected, had gathered to hear the final resolution of the mystery. Miss Marple sat quietly at the back of the room, her gaze steady, though her mind was still, with the child who had spent so many years under false pretenses. The inspector stood before the gathered crowd, clearing his throat as he prepared to speak. His voice was firm and commanding, the kind that always drew attention in a room full of strangers. Ladies and gentlemen, Craig began, we have come to the conclusion of our investigation into the late Lydia Hargrave's estate and the claim made by Mr. John Marple. After extensive review of hospital records, parish files, and various other documents, it has become clear that Mr. Marple's claim to the estate is not valid. He paused, watching as a crowd shifted, their interest peaked. However, the truth is more complicated than that. John Marple, though not the biological son of Miss Marple, was, in fact, the son of Lydia Hargrave's sister, Martha Marple. The confusion surrounding his birth and adoption was a result of a series of unfortunate events, including the fact that Lydia Hargrave had kept the child hidden even from her closest friends and family. A murmur rippled through the room. Craig continued, the estate of Lydia Hargrave, in accordance with her wishes, will now be passed on to John Marple, the true heir. He will receive the full inheritance, including the family estate and all associated debts. We have made arrangements for him to receive the full legal recognition he's entitled to. As the inspector finished speaking, the crowd sat in stunned silence. There were no cheers, snoot bursts, only quiet contemplation. The mystery had been solved, and the pieces had fallen into place, but it wasn't the conclusion Nanyan had expected. Later that evening, as the villager turned to its regular routine, Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table, staring out at the darkening sky. The truth had been revealed, but the questions it raised still lingered in her mind. She had always known that there were things about people that were hidden, locked away in the quiet corners, set their hearts. But this had been something else, something far deeper than she could have imagined. Lydia Hargrave had tried to protect the child from the world. She had hidden him away, pretending that he wasn't a part of the family, when in fact was the missing link, the final piece of the puzzle that had been locked away so many years. But now the truth was out, and though Ethod cost many lives and many years of silence, it was finalizing. As Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, she felt the faintest stir of relief. The case had been closed, but the lessons it carried remained as sharp as severed truth. No matter how buried, would always rise to the surface, and when it did, it was the strongest of all forces. Miss Marple took a sip of her teeth, warmth of it soothing her tired mind. In time, she knew the village would settle again. The shadows of the past would fade into the quiet history of Rose Hill. But for now, Miss Marple was content. The world had its mysteries. At least for today, the most important one had been solved.